Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey deep into the dark and disturbing world of ancient Egypt. Specifically, the pharaohs, the rulers who were worshipped as gods and feared as tyrants. Imagine yourself standing before them, immortal kings and queens who could command life and death with a word. Sounds intense? Right, well, let's just say you probably won't survive this journey without a few chills down your spine. But no worries, we'll be in this together. The life of a pharaoh wasn't quite like the luxurious existence that might spring to mind when we think about ancient kings and queens. Yes, there were the golden treasures, the fine linens, the extravagant feasts. But behind the wealth and the title of living god lay something far more sinister. The pharaohs ruled with absolute power. And this power came at a chilling price. Their lives were not only about maintaining their throne, but about keeping death at bay, ensuring their legacies survived, and that they, too, were immortalized. You might think the pharaohs lived lives of untold luxury, and in many ways, they did. But they also lived with a constant fear of betrayal, assassination, and the ever-present threat of their subjects or rivals rising up against them. Imagine spending your days in a palace filled with servants and soldiers. Yet every whispered conversation or glance from a trusted advisor could be a sign that someone wanted you dead. The further you climb, the more treacherous the climb becomes, and the more paranoid you get. Historians still argue whether the great pharaoh Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, ever truly slept soundly during his reign. Sure, he led successful military campaigns, built monumental structures, and outlived most of his contemporaries. But is it possible that he couldn't escape the weight of what it meant to rule with divine power? After all, even the mightiest pharaohs were human. Even they had their own demons. You settle deeper into the story now, and it's time to discuss the most chilling aspect of being a pharaoh. How they weren't just rulers, they were living gods. You might be picturing a powerful, regal leader, adorned with gold and jewels. But the pharaohs took things a step further. They didn't just rule. They were divine in the eyes of their people. The ancient Egyptians didn't see their rulers as mere mortals. They were the physical embodiment of gods on earth. They could speak for Ra, the sun god, and even represent Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Imagine walking into a room where everyone bowed not because of your title, but because they believed your very existence was ordained by the divine. This belief gave pharaohs immense power. They were more than just rulers. They were intermediaries between the gods and humans. Their word was law, and their command could turn the tide of war, harvest, or fate itself. A pharaoh could control life and death, literally. Some pharaohs, like Akhenaten, even reformed the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods to suit their vision of what divine rule should look like. Historians still debate whether the godlike status of the pharaohs truly went to their heads, or if they were merely playing a long game, using religion as a way to manipulate and solidify their grip on power. We'll never truly know. But one thing is clear. Those who ruled Egypt had an unmatched level of control over both the physical and spiritual realms. On top of this power came a dark responsibility. It wasn't just about receiving praise and wealth. If a pharaoh didn't live up to the divine expectations, their legacy could be obliterated, their memory erased from history. The ancient Egyptians didn't mess around when it came to the afterlife. And a ruler's soul had to be perfectly preserved, or face the wrath of forgotten spirits. Let's not forget how deeply ingrained the belief in the afterlife was in the pharaohs' minds. They didn't just live for today, they lived for eternity. This idea of divinity didn't just keep them in power, it was their shield against the terrifying unknowns of death. The one thing that no pharaoh could truly control. Imagine having all the wealth, power, and control in the world, but knowing that your soul could still be at risk. Let's take a step back in time, to the very first pharaoh who would lay the foundation for a dynasty of rulers, where power, paranoia, and divine rule would intertwine. Narmer, also known as Men's. The first pharaoh of unified Egypt. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was no small feat. And Narmer was the one who achieved it, becoming the first ruler of the land that would later be known as Egypt. With this act of unification, Narmer's reign marked the beginning of the dynasty of pharaohs that would span millennia. Narmer didn't just build a nation, he established a legacy of power that would haunt Egypt for centuries. Historians still argue about the exact nature of Narmer's rule. Was it through brute force, strategic diplomacy, or a combination of both? What we do know is that he likely wasn't the peaceful ruler many might imagine when they think of a pharaoh. His reign was filled with violence and conquest. His famous Narmer palette, an ancient ceremonial stone, depicts him in the act of smiting his enemies, showing just how brutal and ruthless his rise to power was. His actions laid the groundwork for the pharaohs who followed, rulers who would come to use their divine status to cement their authority through violence, fear, and control. Narmer's legacy was one of divine kingship, but it was also one of bloody conquest, a legacy that many of his successors would follow, proving that even the first pharaoh understood that divine rule often meant ruling with iron fists and a sword at the ready. Imagine the level of paranoia that must have seeped into Narmer's rule, knowing that any one of his subjects could challenge him, especially when his entire power base was built upon not just his military might, but his status as the god on earth. He couldn't afford to be seen as weak, and from Narmer onward, the pharaohs would have to deal with an ever-present fear of rebellion, assassination, and betrayal. They didn't just have to defend their physical kingdoms, they had to protect their divine status. It was a tightrope walk that would lead many to their graves, quite literally. As you wander through the shadowy corridors of Egypt's past, let's take a moment to understand the lives of the pharaohs. The riches, the power, the divine status. It all sounds like a dream, right? But behind those glimmering jewels and silk robes, there was a much darker, more troubling side to life at the top. If you were a pharaoh, your days were filled with luxury and excess, but also with an intense, suffocating paranoia. The court was often a nest of spies and betrayal, where anyone from your closest advisor to a distant relative could be plotting your downfall. Remember, you didn't just have the weight of the world on your shoulders. You had the weight of the gods. The pharaohs, despite being seen as gods, were just as vulnerable to the threat of assassination or coups as any other ruler. Pharaohs could only hold on to their divine right to rule as long as they could maintain order and prevent any challengers from rising against them. If someone from the court, a rival, or even a member of their own family saw an opening, they would take it. One wrong step and you could be dead, your reign ended, your soul possibly doomed, and your legacy erased. Historians still argue over just how many pharaohs met their end at the hands of those closest to them. The story of Pharaoh Ramses III, for example, is infamous for a plot hatched by one of his wives and her sons, an assassination attempt that nearly succeeded. though Ramses was ultimately murdered, leaving his kingdom in turmoil. And even if the pharaohs managed to survive, their lives were often marked by an ever-present sense of dread. Let's think about Cleopatra, for instance. While she is better known for her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her life was also steeped in fear. She lived through the deaths of her brothers, her rivalries, and battles for the throne that were all but inevitable. In this royal world, there was no room for mistakes and no room for weakness. One slip and it could cost you everything. You might think that all this wealth and power would buy a pharaoh peace of mind, but it didn't. Instead, it often led to a mind forever haunted by the fear that someone or something was plotting against them. Now, we've touched on the fragile lives of these rulers. But let's dive into one of the most unsettling aspects of being a pharaoh: the practice of mummification. You see, while most of us might associate mummies with spooky Halloween decorations or Indiana Jones adventures, for the pharaohs, mummification was a serious, sacred business. This wasn't just about preserving the body for eternity. It was about ensuring their immortality. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't an end. It was simply a passage into another, often far more terrifying, realm. And for a pharaoh, if your soul was going to be judged by the gods in the afterlife, your body had to be in perfect condition. But the process was long, meticulous, and, let's be honest, pretty disturbing. The first step, removal of the internal organs, which were thought to be the first to decay. The brain. It was discarded entirely through the nose, a process that, you'll be happy to know, was done with an iron hook. The heart, however, was kept, because that was the center of life and would be weighed in the afterlife. The organs were then carefully preserved in canopic jars, which were placed inside the tomb with the mummified body. Historians still argue about just how many pharaohs actually underwent the process of mummification to such an extreme degree. But it's clear that some pharaohs were mummified with such attention to detail that it borders on the macabre. They weren't just being preserved. They were being perfected for the next life, which made the whole thing feel like a twisted combination of funeral rites and life insurance. The mummification process itself wasn't just a way to avoid decay. It was a way to fight against the inevitability of death, to ensure the pharaoh's soul could return to the land of the living. Imagine that kind of paranoia, living every day not only worried about your throne, but also about ensuring your soul didn't end up lost in the underworld, judged by a god like Osiris. The pharaohs were so obsessed with this process that they didn't just build tombs for themselves. They created entire cities of the dead, complete with servants to accompany them into the afterlife. It wasn't enough to be buried with wealth and treasures. Everything needed to be just right to guarantee their eternal return. And let's not forget about the burial tombs themselves. The grandest of these were the pyramids, built not just as a place to house the body, but as a massive marker of the pharaoh's power, an eternal home to hold the pharaoh's spirit for centuries. They were never meant to be disturbed. But the curse of the pharaohs tells us otherwise. The legend of the curse of the pharaohs is one of the most chilling aspects of ancient Egyptian lore, and it's something that still grips our imagination today. The idea that anyone who dared disturb a pharaoh's tomb would face a horrible fate became so widespread that it quickly turned into a powerful superstition. It wasn't just about robbing a tomb and taking treasures. It was about disturbing the sacred rest of someone who was, by divine right, considered a living god. The punishment, well, It was supposed to be death, often in a manner that was as mysterious as it was grisly. Let's take the case of the famous discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. The excitement of finding one of Egypt's most celebrated pharaohs, largely untouched by grave robbers, was almost too much to bear. But as soon as the tomb was opened, a series of unfortunate and untimely deaths began to plague those who had been involved in the discovery. Lord Carnarvon, the British aristocrat who funded the expedition, died just months after the tomb was opened. Some say from an infected mosquito bite. Others whisper it was the curse of the pharaohs. Soon after, several other members of the excavation team perished under strange circumstances. Could this all be coincidence? Or was the curse truly at work? Historians still argue whether this curse was a creation of coincidence and bad luck, or if there was some ancient curse truly tied to the tombs. Some believe that the so-called curse was a powerful tool used by the priests of ancient Egypt to discourage tomb robbing, and it may have been instilled into the culture for generations. Whether real or imagined, the mystery surrounding King Tut's tomb has kept the stories alive, casting a shadow over Egypt's archaeological treasures and continuing to terrify those who venture too close to the ancient tombs. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this curse is what it represents. The idea that a pharaoh, even in death, could reach out from beyond the grave to protect their legacy. It speaks to the terrifying belief that the divine power of the pharaohs was so strong, their spirits so vengeful, that nothing, not even death, could stop them from ensuring their eternal dominion. So, next time you think about visiting an ancient tomb or exploring the pyramids, remember, you might just be walking through a place where the dead pharaohs still hold the power to keep their secrets forever. As we journey further through the shadows of Egypt's history, we must turn our attention to one of the most extraordinary figures to ever sit on the throne. Queen Hatshepsut. She was a pharaoh who dared to defy centuries of tradition and break through the rigid gender norms of ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut wasn't just a regent or consort. She declared herself pharaoh in her own right, and in doing so, she opened the door for women to rule. Her reign, however, was marked by not just remarkable success, but by a series of mysterious deaths and power struggles that left her legacy clouded in intrigue. You might imagine that being a woman at the top of Egypt's political pyramid would have been a bit of a challenge. But Hatshepsut managed it, ruling Egypt for over 20 years and overseeing one of its most prosperous periods. She expanded trade, launched successful building projects, and even sent expeditions to the land of Punt, bringing back goods that enriched Egypt's coffers. She wasn't just a ruler, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her statues and reliefs depict her with a royal beard and male attire, emphasizing her divine right to rule. But behind her carefully crafted image, there were whispers. Historians still argue about the legitimacy of her reign. Some believe Hatshepsut's rise to power was based on shrewd political maneuvering, while others claim she was simply protecting the throne for her young stepson, Thutmose III, who would later attempt to erase her from history after Hatshepsut's death. Many of her monuments and statues were defaced, and her name was removed from the royal lists. But why was it a mere political move? Or was it something more sinister? An effort to suppress the memory of a woman who had ruled too effectively for comfort? Her tomb, located in the Valley of the Kings, is a silent testament to the strange and possibly disturbing events that surrounded her life and death. While historians have speculated about the cause of her death, whether it was natural or something darker, it's the mystery of her erasure that lingers in the shadows. Did her stepson, Thutmose III, orchestrate her removal from history after her death to secure his own reign? Or did a darker conspiracy exist within the palace? Some believe that even in death, Hatshepsut's memory was violently attacked because she had overstepped the bounds of what was acceptable for a woman in power. Hatshepsut's story is one of courage, but also one of caution. Her reign may have been a time of peace and prosperity, but it was marred by the uneasy truth that no pharaoh's power was truly safe, not even after death. And that's something every ruler would come to face, eventually. As we move from one pharaoh to the next, let's focus on one of the most famous and mysterious figures in ancient Egypt, King Tutankhamun, known to the modern world as the Boy King. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at a mere 9 years old, and his death at just 18 years old has captivated historians and archaeologists for decades. His reign was short, and while he didn't accomplish much during his lifetime, his tomb, discovered in 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter, changed the course of Egyptology forever. The discovery of the nearly intact tomb was like finding a time capsule, full of treasures, relics, and mysteries that have yet to be fully unraveled. But it was the strange circumstances surrounding his death that have haunted Egyptologists and fueled the famous curse of the pharaohs. Let's talk about Tut's death for a moment. Historians still argue over the cause. Was it a tragic accident, an illness, or something far more sinister? Some theorists believe Tut may have been struck by a deadly disease, such as malaria, while others suggest he was injured in a chariot accident, as evidence of a broken leg was found in his mummified body. But there's also a tantalizing theory that suggests foul play. Some believe that Tut was murdered. Who could have wanted to kill a young king who had barely started his reign? Historians still debate the true cause of his untimely demise. Was it a plot by those within his court? If so, why? Some speculate that Tut's early death led to the rise of more powerful figures in his court, like the priesthood of Amun, whose influence over Egypt was growing stronger. Whatever the cause, the fact that Tut died so suddenly, so young, has left a lingering sense of mystery and intrigue surrounding his tomb. And the discovery of his tomb, sealed and untouched for thousands of years, was met with eerie events that only fueled the idea of a curse. The so-called curse of the pharaohs began to gain traction after several members of the excavation team, including Lord Carnarvon, the financier behind the tomb's discovery, died under strange and untimely circumstances. Carnarvon's death shortly after the tomb's opening seemed to confirm the myth, and the stories of bad luck and mysterious deaths spread like wildfire. Whether these deaths were mere coincidences or something more, they certainly contributed to the eerie reputation of Tutankhamun's tomb and the notion that disturbing a pharaoh's final resting place could bring doom to the living. Despite all the mystery surrounding his death, Tutankhamun's tomb remains one of the most significant archaeological finds in history. It not only shed light on the life of this enigmatic king, but also gave us an intimate glimpse into the burial practices, wealth, and customs of ancient Egypt. The disturbing tales of his death and the curse that followed continue to haunt the narrative surrounding him, adding an extra layer of eerie fascination to the already captivating world of the pharaohs. As we continue our exploration of Egypt's fascinating and often disturbing world, let's delve into the grim reality of those who built the pharaohs' grand monuments, the pyramids, the tombs, and the majestic temples, all of these enduring symbols of ancient Egypt were constructed by tens of thousands of workers. Yet, behind the awe-inspiring architecture and the glory of the pharaohs, there lies a much darker story, the lives of the laborers who built these monuments, many of whom paid the ultimate price for their work. You may imagine that the construction of the pyramids was a well-organized and skilled labor force. But in reality, much of it involved forced labor, with workers toiling long hours under grueling conditions. Contrary to the popular belief that the pyramids were built by slaves, evidence suggests that many of these workers were actually skilled laborers, some of whom may have been conscripted for a limited period, while others were permanent laborers employed by the state. Yet, regardless of their status, their lives were harsh and short. Historians still argue whether these workers were truly slaves or simply conscripted laborers who had little choice in the matter. What's clear, however, is that the conditions under which they worked were brutal. Imagine working in the blistering Egyptian heat, hauling massive stone blocks and chiseling them into precise shapes, often under the watchful eye of overseers who were ruthless in enforcing productivity. These laborers were housed in workers' villages that were often close to the construction sites, villages filled with the sounds of constant labor, of stone against stone, and of the relentless march of progress. What's truly disturbing, though, is the way death was often tied to their work. Many workers didn't survive the harsh conditions, from heat stroke to injury, disease to malnutrition. The death toll was staggering. Skeletal remains from workers' cemeteries near the pyramids show signs of physical strain, worn joints, broken bones, and signs of long-term suffering. It's a grim reality that the grandeur of the pharaohs' tombs was built on the backs of those who would never see the final product. The pyramid workers were often buried near their places of work, a sign of their close relationship to the pharaohs' monuments. They were given rudimentary tombs, some of which contained simple offerings for the afterlife, but they were far removed from the opulence that the pharaohs themselves enjoyed. While the pharaohs would be buried in grand tombs, with treasure to accompany them into eternity, the workers were relegated to simple graves, their bodies barely recognized after their deaths. Despite the harsh conditions, the workers did have one advantage. They believed in the afterlife, just like the pharaohs. This belief, deeply rooted in ancient Egyptian culture, gave them a sense of hope, even in the face of their grueling lives. They thought that by helping build the pharaoh's tomb, they were securing their own place in the afterlife, perhaps with the same eternal rewards that the pharaohs themselves would receive. In this way, their suffering was tied to the grand narrative of Egyptian spirituality, where death was not an end, but a passage to something greater. But the irony of it all is that these laborers, who worked so hard to ensure the pharaoh's legacy, often saw their lives end in tragedy, never knowing whether their efforts would be remembered or if their afterlives would truly be what they hoped. For the pharaohs, the construction of these monuments was a symbol of their divinity and immortality. But for the laborers, it was a dark reminder of the price paid for a ruler's eternal fame. As we continue exploring the disturbing world of Egypt's rulers, it's time to focus on the rise of the priests of Amun, a group whose influence rivaled that of the pharaohs themselves. The priesthood of Amun wasn't just a religious institution. It was a powerful political force, one that played a major role in shaping the fate of Egypt during the New Kingdom period. While the pharaohs sat on their thrones, the priests controlled vast wealth, lands, and armies, creating a shadow empire that often operated behind the scenes. manipulating the politics of Egypt in their favor. The rise of Amun, the sun god, began to overshadow the pharaohs in the 18th dynasty. And by the time of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the priesthood had amassed such power that they practically ruled Egypt from the shadows. It's believed that the priests of Amun had control over nearly half of Egypt's land that was directly under their religious jurisdiction. As the wealth and power of the priesthood grew, so did their ability to influence the pharaohs themselves. The priests had one goal: to maintain their own power and ensure that the pharaohs remained nothing more than figureheads, allowing them to pull the strings from behind the scenes. Historians still argue whether the rise of Amun's priesthood was purely a political maneuver or a genuine religious movement. What's clear is that the pharaohs, who were supposed to be the ultimate authority in Egypt, were often at odds with the priests, and when a pharaoh attempted to challenge the power of Amun, it could result in dangerous consequences. The infamous Akhenaten, for example, tried to change the religious landscape by promoting the worship of Aten, the sun disk, over Amun. This radical shift in religious policy caused a massive upheaval in Egypt, and the priests of Amun fought back fiercely, ultimately reclaiming their influence. One of the darkest chapters in the history of Egypt's priesthood was during the reign of Ramses XI, the last pharaoh of the new kingdom. By this time, the power of the priests had become so great that they essentially controlled the wealth of Egypt. As the pharaoh's power waned, the priests stepped in to fill the void, ruling in the name of their god. Their greed and corruption were so rampant that it contributed to the slow collapse of Egypt's once glorious empire. The priesthood's influence didn't end with the fall of the new kingdom. Even after Egypt was conquered by foreign invaders, such as the Persians and later the Greeks, the priests of Amun continued to hold on to their power, clinging to the remnants of Egypt's ancient glory. Their legacy left a dark stain on the history of Egypt, one of manipulation, intrigue, and religious tyranny that helped shape the course of the country's decline. What's particularly disturbing about the priests of Amun is the way they used religion as a tool of control. They weren't just keepers of sacred knowledge. They were political strategists who understood that religion could be wielded to maintain dominance. The fear of angering a god, combined with the priest's control over religious rituals, allowed them to manipulate the people. It's a grim reminder that in ancient Egypt, even the divine was not safe from corruption and power struggles. As we look back on the history of the pharaohs and their priestly counterparts, we're faced with the chilling truth. The once sacred institution of divine rule became a battleground for power, greed, and manipulation. The priests of Amun, while revered as spiritual guides, ultimately helped push Egypt toward its downfall, proving that even in a land where gods walked among men, the pursuit of power could corrupt even the most holy. As we continue our journey through the twisted history of Egypt's rulers, we now turn to one of the most controversial and tragic pharaohs to ever walk the earth, Akhenaten. His reign was nothing short of a radical upheaval in the ancient world. As he attempted to dismantle centuries of Egyptian religious tradition and impose a singular worship of the sun god. Aten, imagine the audacity of a pharaoh, who, as a living god himself, sought to replace the entire pantheon of Egyptian deities with a single, seemingly abstract god, the sun. Akhenaten's reign marks a distinct break from the long-established order. Historians still argue whether his shift to monotheism was born out of genuine religious belief, or if it was an attempt to consolidate political power by weakening the influence of the powerful priesthood of Amun. What is clear, though, is that Akhenaten's radical policies created chaos both in Egypt's religious landscape and in its political structure. For generations, the Egyptian people had worshipped a vast array of gods, each with its own temple, priesthood, and influence. But under Akhenaten, all these gods were suddenly abandoned. He closed the temples, exiled the priests, and erased the names of traditional deities from monuments and inscriptions. To Akhenaten, Aten was the only god worthy of worship. Everything else was an illusion. This belief, however, did not sit well with the people. The priests of Amun, particularly, were outraged, as their power and wealth were based on the old religion. Akhenaten's actions threatened not just their sacred duties, but the very fabric of society. Imagine the shock and anger of the people as their pharaoh declared that all their gods were false, and that only the sun god Aten was real. The very essence of their spiritual identity was being ripped away, and the pharaoh himself was the one doing the ripping. Historians still debate whether Akhenaten's reforms were the beginning of Egypt's decline. His reign was short-lived. After his death, the pharaohs who followed him, including the famous Tutankhamun, immediately reversed his policies. The old gods were reinstalled, the priests of Amun regained their power, and Akhenaten's name was erased from the royal records. His monuments were defaced, and his city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, was abandoned. It was as if the very foundations of his rule were purposefully swept away, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of regret. But even as his reign crumbled, Akhenaten left behind an undeniable legacy. His art, which depicted him and his family in a more naturalistic and intimate manner, was revolutionary. Unlike the idealized, formal portraits of earlier pharaohs, Akhenaten's depictions were raw and personal, showing him with his wife Nefertiti and their children in relaxed, natural poses. It was a glimpse into the personal life of a pharaoh, something unheard of in the rigid, divine images that usually adorned Egyptian tombs and temples. Akhenaten's legacy, though overshadowed by his controversial religious reforms, continues to fascinate historians and scholars today. Was he truly a visionary, ahead of his time? Or was he a delusional ruler who attempted to remake Egypt in his image, only to watch it collapse around him? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. Akhenaten's reign was one of the most disturbing and mysterious chapters in Egypt's history, one that left a lasting impact on the kingdom and its people. Moving deeper into the shadows of Egypt's rulers, we now confront the terrifying reality of the pharaoh's most brutal weapon: fear. The pharaohs didn't just rely on divine status and religious manipulation to maintain power. They also ruled through sheer terror. Death, torture, and public execution were tools in their arsenals, employed to maintain control over a population that might otherwise rise up against them. Imagine being in ancient Egypt, where the slightest offense could mean your life, and the pharaoh's wrath would come down upon you without mercy. One of the most chilling aspects of the pharaoh's rule was the way they used public executions to remind their subjects who was in charge. The fear of death, torture, or being sent to the underworld was a constant presence in Egyptian society. Any disobedience could lead to an agonizing death. A pharaoh's word was not just law, it was divine law, and the penalty for breaking it was often swift and brutal. Take, for example, the infamous punishment of the traitors and enemies of the pharaoh. It's said that the pharaohs would sometimes publicly execute these individuals in horrific ways, often as a spectacle meant to deter others from even thinking about defying the ruler. These punishments weren't just about the act of killing. They were about the message that the pharaoh's power could not be questioned. The executions were carried out with the most gruesome methods possible, ranging from impalement to burning alive, all meant to break the spirit of the people and remind them that to defy the pharaoh was to challenge the gods themselves. Historians still debate whether these brutal executions were as common as some of the stories suggest, or if they've been exaggerated over time. However, there is no denying that the pharaohs understood the power of fear. In a land where the pharaoh was believed to be the earthly representative of the gods, his word was the final one, and to challenge it meant risking death. The use of fear was one of the most disturbing elements of the pharaoh's reign. It kept the kingdom in check, but it also created an atmosphere of constant anxiety, where the innocent and the guilty alike could fall victim to the pharaoh's wrath. But this didn't only apply to their subjects. Even family members weren't safe. The pharaoh's own children, siblings, and close advisors could be killed without warning if they were perceived as a threat. Remember the case of Ramses III, whose reign was marred by an assassination plot orchestrated by one of his wives and her sons. This treachery was nothing out of the ordinary. It was, in fact, a symptom of the deadly political environment the pharaohs created. Murder within the royal family was commonplace, as any potential rival could be seen as a threat to the throne. This brutal enforcement of power extended beyond the palace walls. In the case of war, the pharaohs would also engage in ruthless tactics, often obliterating entire cities or villages that resisted them. The idea wasn't just to conquer, it was to break the will of the people and send a message that no one, no matter how far away, was safe from the pharaoh's reach. The use of terror during wartime was as much about control as it was about military victory. The idea that the pharaohs could simply take life at their discretion, whether through execution, war, or even the removal of political rivals, was not just a reality, but a terrifying one. It created an environment where the people lived in constant fear of the pharaoh's power. While most rulers maintained a facade of authority, the pharaohs lived with the frightening knowledge that they were seen as gods on earth, and gods could do anything. As we continue to unearth the dark and disturbing truth of the pharaoh's reign, we must turn our attention to the relationships pharaohs maintained with their wives and the political marriages that were often marked by both power and secrecy. In ancient Egypt, marriage was not just a personal matter, it was a political tool. Pharaohs strategically married within their own family or to foreign rulers' daughters to solidify their power, expand their influence, and secure alliances. Yet behind the gilded curtains of these marriages lay jealousy, betrayal, and the same ruthless ambition that marked the pharaoh's rule. Take, for example, Sut, the infamous Cleopatra VII, though she is often remembered for her romantic entanglements with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Her marriages were steeped in political maneuvering and power struggles. Her first marriage, at the age of 18, was to her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was also her co-ruler. This was a common practice in Egypt, where royal siblings married to keep the bloodline pure. However, their marriage quickly became a battleground for control of Egypt, with Cleopatra and her brother engaged in a violent civil war. In the end, her brother was defeated, and Cleopatra not only emerged victorious, but later forged a new political alliance with Julius Caesar. This political marriage, though laced with personal emotions, was ultimately a tactical move to secure her throne. Historians still debate whether Cleopatra's marriages were based on love or calculated moves for power. One thing is for sure: she was no stranger to using her relationships to her advantage. This was true for many pharaohs. A pharaoh's marriage to his queen was often a public affair. But the behind-the-scenes intrigue was a different story. It's said that Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar wasn't just romantic. It was a crucial step in keeping Egypt independent from the looming power of Rome. Her later alliance with Mark Antony was similarly born out of political necessity. And despite their famous love story, it was their shared ambition for power that ultimately defined their union. But not all pharaoh marriages were filled with such external drama. In many cases, the pharaoh's wives had to fight for power within the palace. Queen Nefertiti, one of the most famous of all Egyptian queens, was not just the wife of Akhenaten, but also his co-regent, wielding considerable influence during his reign. However, after Akhenaten's death, her position was quickly overshadowed by her stepson, Tutankhamun, and the powerful priesthood of Amun. Historians still wonder whether Nefertiti was quietly removed from the throne due to political maneuvering. Some believe she ruled for a short time as pharaoh in her own right after Akhenaten's death, though her reign was not officially recorded. The mystery surrounding her disappearance from the historical record continues to stir debate. Behind every royal marriage lay not just the hope for political stability, but the ever-present threat of assassination, betrayal, or even a forced divorce. The pharaohs' marriages were often battlegrounds of their own, where power and survival were at stake. In Egypt's cutthroat royal courts, love, if it existed, was secondary to securing one's rule. Many marriages were formed out of necessity, and once a pharaoh's grip on power was threatened, their spouse could quickly become a casualty of war, manipulation, or political play. This constant struggle for dominance within the royal family was a disturbing feature of the pharaoh's rule. Those closest to the throne, whether they were spouses, children, or siblings, could quickly turn into enemies. A pharaoh's life wasn't just filled with external threats. It was filled with internal betrayal, where the people you trusted most could be the very ones conspiring to bring you down. If the pharaoh's rule could be sustained through marriage, it could just as easily be destroyed by it. Now, we arrive at the inevitable, the fall of the pharaohs. The once mighty rulers who held the title of gods on earth could not escape the creeping decay of time, both from within their own empire and from the foreign powers that circled like vultures. Though their reigns were marked by grand monuments, divine power, and unimaginable wealth, Egypt's mighty pharaohs eventually faltered, and the empire crumbled. By the time the great Ramses II, Ramses the Great, died in 1213 BCE, Egypt was already beginning to show signs of its decline. Ramses, known for his military prowess, monumental building projects, and long reign, was one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. However, even his power couldn't shield Egypt from the waves of political instability and invasions that followed. After Ramses' death, Egypt slowly began to lose its dominance. Successive pharaohs failed to maintain the unity he had fought so hard to achieve, and the empire was weakened by constant internal strife, economic decline, and corruption. Historians still argue about the precise causes of Egypt's decline. Was it the economic toll of building and maintaining such monumental structures? Was it the rising power of the priesthoods, especially the priests of Amun, who became so powerful that they overshadowed the pharaohs themselves? Or was it the external pressures, as invasions from the Sea Peoples and the Assyrians gradually chipped away at Egypt's borders? It was likely a combination of all these factors, each one a dagger slowly piercing the heart of Egypt's once invincible empire. But what truly set the stage for Egypt's ultimate collapse was the weakening of the pharaohs themselves. As the centuries passed, the pharaoh's divine status became less certain. The belief that the pharaoh was a living god became strained. The internal unrest and the inability of successive rulers to defend Egypt from invaders led to a loss of faith in the monarchy. A pharaoh was supposed to be a powerful divine figure who could bring order and prosperity. But as Egypt's enemies grew stronger and internal divisions widened, the once sacred figure of the pharaoh no longer commanded the respect and fear it once did. One of the most disturbing aspects of Egypt's decline was the fall of the once proud capital, Thebes. The city had been the religious heart of Egypt for centuries, home to the great temple of Karnak. But by the 21st dynasty, it was in ruins. What had once been a thriving city, filled with gold and incense, became a decaying symbol of Egypt's crumbling empire. Foreign invaders, corrupt priests, and weak leadership had reduced Egypt's former glory to little more than a shadow of its former self. In the final stages of Egypt's collapse, the pharaohs became little more than puppets, controlled by foreign powers or local elites. The last native Egyptian dynasty ended in 343 BCE with the death of the pharaoh Nectanebo-II, and soon after, Egypt fell under the control of Alexander the Great and his successors, the once mighty pharaohs. Those divine kings who had once commanded the fear and admiration of an entire civilization were no more. Egypt had become just another piece of the world conquered by foreign empires. The final days of Egypt's pharaohs were marked by a kind of eerie quiet. Once, the pharaohs had ruled with absolute power, their voices heard across the land. But in the end, their dynasty was overtaken by more powerful forces, leaving behind only the echoes of their once mighty civilization. Their monumental tombs, filled with treasures and inscriptions, were looted by invaders, and the pharaoh's divine status was reduced to myth. Yet, even as Egypt faded into history, the legacy of its pharaohs lived on. The stories of their power, their cruelty, their divine rule, and their ultimate fall continue to captivate the world. Their monuments, buried in sand and tombs, still haunt us today, as a reminder of a civilization that rose to unimaginable heights, only to fall into ruin. As the centuries pass, Egypt's pharaohs have become figures of myth and mystery. Their lives a disturbing blend of divine power, tragedy, and destruction. But even as their empire faded into the pages of history, the legacy of their reign continues to echo in the modern world. The monuments, tombs, and artifacts left behind by these rulers serve as haunting reminders of their once unimaginable power and the darkness that accompanied it. The tombs of the pharaohs, most famously those in the Valley of the Kings, remain some of the most awe-inspiring sights in the world. But even as their magnificence captivates visitors, it's impossible to forget the chilling tales that surround them. The ancient Egyptians believed that the pharaohs' tombs were not just burial places. They were the pharaohs' final homes, where their souls would remain for eternity. These tombs were filled with treasures, food, and servants meant to accompany the pharaohs into the afterlife. But they were also designed with extreme care to protect the ruler's soul from the dangers of the underworld. Yet, ironically, it was these tombs that would become the final resting places of many would-be grave robbers and even modern explorers. The curse of the Pharaohs, once thought to be a myth, continues to spark fear and fascination. The idea that disturbing a pharaoh's tomb would bring doom has plagued generations of archaeologists, with several high-profile deaths of those involved in the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb reinforcing the myth. Whether you believe in the curse or not, the mysterious deaths of those who uncovered the tomb of one of Egypt's most enigmatic rulers make for a chilling story. But the pharaoh's legacy isn't just about the stories of curses and death. It's also about the culture they created, a culture steeped in religion, ritual, and the quest for immortality. The pharaohs, while ultimately human, were seen as gods on earth, and their reign was defined by the belief that they could control not only the living world, but also the world of the dead. They believed their divine power would ensure their rule for eternity. But their obsession with immortality often blinded them to the political and military realities that ultimately led to their downfall. Despite their power, the pharaohs couldn't stop the march of time, nor could they prevent the inevitable decay of their empire. Egypt, like every great civilization, eventually faced its decline. The pharaohs fell, the monuments eroded, and the once glorious kingdom was overrun by foreign invaders. But the tombs, the pyramids, and the remains of the pharaoh's reign still stand today, as haunting relics of a world long gone. And so, as we reflect on the disturbing lives of Egypt's rulers, we are left with one unsettling truth: the pharaohs, for all their divine status and grandeur, were never truly immortal. They may have ruled with unimaginable power and left behind a legacy of staggering monuments. But their eventual fall serves as a reminder that no one, not even a god, can escape the ravages of time. The tombs, the artifacts, and the stories we have today are all that remain of a civilization that once believed it could conquer death itself. Now, as the final echoes of Egypt's glory fade into history, the story of the pharaohs lingers in the darkness. Their disturbing lives, marked by ambition, paranoia, and betrayal, remain a haunting part of our collective imagination. Their monuments still rise from the desert sands, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of gods on earth, reminding us that no power, no matter how divine, is immune to time's ultimate grip. And as you drift off into sleep, perhaps you can still hear the whispers of those ancient rulers, their spirits lingering in the very tombs they built to preserve their immortality, their legacies forever etched into the sands of time.